Write in the comments which country you're watching from, and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. In the heart of the world's most powerful empire, a chilling whisper echoed through the marble halls of Topkapi Palace. It was a law written not in ink, but in blood, a law that turned brother against brother, forcing princes to see their own kin not as family, but as a threat to be eliminated. This is the story of the Ottoman Law of Fratricide, a brutal necessity for order, a curse upon a dynasty. How did a father's love curdle into a state-sanctioned command to kill his own sons? We descend into the gilded cage of power to uncover why sultans had to kill their brothers. In the sprawling tapestry of empires, few threads are as dark or as crimson as the one that bound the Ottoman dynasty. To understand it, we must travel back to the windswept plains of Anatolia in the 14th century. The Ottomans were not yet masters of the world, but a rising power, a small principality, or beylik, forged in the crucible of faith and fire. Their traditions were born of the steppe, rooted in a Turkic-Mongol heritage that viewed sovereignty not as a singular point of light, but as a shared inheritance among the sons of the ruler. The realm was the family's property, and every prince held a legitimate claim to a piece of it. This principle, while noble in theory, was a political death sentence in practice. It was a guarantee of fragmentation, a promise of civil war. The first sultan saw this with terrifying clarity. The ghost of division haunted every succession. When the great Orhan Ghazi died, his son Murad I did not wait for his brothers Ibrahim and Halil to rally armies. He acted with a chilling pragmatism, eliminating them to secure his own ascension. This was not yet law, but a brutal, instinctual act of state preservation. The most infamous early example came later, on a field of blood and victory. In 1389, at the Battle of Kosovo, Sultan Murad I was killed. His son, Bayezid, was immediately proclaimed the new sultan on the battlefield. His first command? It was not to rally the troops or pursue the enemy. It was an order for the execution of his own brother, Yaqub, who had fought valiantly beside him all day. As Yaqub was led away to be strangled with a silk bowstring, a death befitting royalty without the shedding of blood, the die was cast. The throne was not a gift to be received, but a prize to be seized. And its deadliest challengers were not foreign kings, but the men who shared your father's blood, the boys you grew up with in the palace. This was the terrifying paradox of the Ottoman prince. To live was to be a threat, and to rule was to become a killer. Sultan Bayezid I, who earned the moniker Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for the speed of his campaigns, applied that same lightning velocity to securing his throne. The execution of his brother Yaqub at Kosovo was not an act of passion or personal hatred. It was a cold, strategic calculation. By eliminating his only rival in a single stroke, Bayezid bypassed the protracted and devastating succession wars that plagued the other Turkic beyliks and Christian kingdoms surrounding him. While his neighbors fractured and bled, the Ottoman state remained a unified, singular weapon, wielded by one undisputed master. This brutal act became a foundation of his powerful, centralized reign. The lesson was stark and unavoidable. Unity, purchased with the blood of a single prince, was infinitely preferable to a peace shattered by the ambitions of many. The state, the Devlet, was a sacred entity, and its survival superseded all other loyalties, even the bonds of family. This grim philosophy began to crystallize within the Ottoman court. It was a choice between two evils. On one hand, the death of a prince, a tragedy confined within the palace walls. On the other, a full-blown civil war, a catastrophe that would consume the entire realm, killing thousands of soldiers and civilians, burning cities, and inviting foreign invasion. For the Sultan, the choice was clear. The life of one brother was weighed against the lives of tens of thousands of his subjects. The stability of the empire was weighed against the grief of a family. In this ruthless calculus, the empire always won. Every prince born into the House of Osman was thus a potential king, but also a potential rebel. He was a rallying point for every discontented pasha, every ambitious courtier, every rebellious faction in the empire. To allow him to live after another brother took the throne was to leave a lit torch in a warehouse of gunpowder. The throne was not merely inherited, it was forged. It was forged in the fires of conquest, but tempered in the blood of kin. Each new sultan had to prove not only his strength against his enemies, but his resolve against his own heart. For all the brutal pragmatism of men like Bayezid the Thunderbolt, the Ottoman dynasty was about to learn its most terrible lesson. The year is 1402. At the Battle of Ankara, the seemingly invincible Ottoman army is annihilated by the forces of the Turco-Mongol conqueror, Timur, also known as Tamerlane. Sultan Bayezid himself is captured, destined to die in captivity a broken man. In a single day, the empire built over a century of conquest and consolidation simply imploded. This was the moment that the practice of fratricide was meant to prevent, now realized on a scale beyond anyone's darkest nightmares. The Ottoman Empire ceased to exist as a unified state. In its place was a gaping wound, a power vacuum into which Bayezid's 4 surviving sons, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed, were thrown. Each prince carved out a piece of the shattered realm for himself. Suleiman ruled from the European capital of Edirne. Isa held the old capital of Bursa. Mehmed controlled a swath of Anatolia from Amasya. Musa, after being released by Timur, joined the fray. For 11 nightmarish years, from 1402 to 1413, the Ottoman interregnum, or Fetret Devri, raged. Brother fought brother in a relentless, ruinous war. They made alliances with the very Christian powers their father had fought to conquer, offering up territory and tribute in exchange for aid against their own kin. The land was ravaged, the people suffered, and the hard-won gains of generations were lost. The ghost of civil war was no longer a ghost, it was a living monster devouring its own children. This cataclysm became the foundational trauma of the Ottoman psyche. It was the ultimate proof, written in blood and fire across the land, that shared power was impossible. The state could have only one head. Finally, after a decade of bloodshed, one brother emerged victorious. Mehmed I, having systematically defeated and killed his siblings, painstakingly stitched the empire back together. He is known to history not as a conqueror of foreign lands, but as the second founder of the Ottoman state. His grim achievement cemented the terrible truth. The only thing more destructive than a sultan killing his brother was a sultan who failed to do so. Decades after his great-grandfather, Mehmed I, reunified a broken empire, a new sultan ascended the throne. He was young, brilliant, and possessed of an ambition that would reshape the map of the world. He was Mehmed II, soon to be known as the Conqueror. The memory of the interregnum was not a distant history lesson to him. It was the defining political reality of his dynasty, a scar on the family's soul. He understood that to build an empire that could fell the 1,000-year-old walls of Constantinople, its foundations had to be unshakable. And an unshakable foundation meant there could be no rivals, no alternate centers of power, no lingering claimants to the throne. Upon his accession to the throne for the second and final time in 1451, his first significant act was one of chilling finality. He ordered the execution of his half-brother, the infant Ahmed, who was still nursing at his mother's breast. It was a shocking act of brutality, but for Mehmed it was a necessary surgery to save the body politic. But he would go further than any of his predecessors. He would not let this grim necessity remain an unspoken, ad hoc tradition. He would transform it from a desperate act into an instrument of state, a pillar of imperial law. In his great legal code, the Kanuname, Mehmed inscribed the practice into the very fabric of the empire. The article is stark and direct. And to whichever of my sons the sultanate is bestowed, it is proper for him to kill his brothers for the common good of the world. Most of the ulama have given their permission for this, so let them act accordingly. The language is profound. This is not murder. It is an execution. It is proper. It is for the common good of the world. By invoking the concept of Nizami Alam, Mehmed elevated fratricide from a dynastic struggle to a sacred duty, a sacrifice made to prevent chaos and ensure order and justice for all of God's subjects under Ottoman rule. With the sanction of the highest religious authorities, a terrible necessity became a hallowed legal obligation. The conqueror, who dreamed of empires, first had to conquer the dissent within his own house, codifying a law of blood to secure a future of glory. When Mehmed the Conqueror died in 1481, the world held its breath. The empire he had forged with fire and genius was now a prize for his two sons, the elder, contemplative Bayezid, and the younger, fiery Cem. A secret message about their father's death reached Bayezid first. This accident of timing would decide everything. While Cem rallied support in Anatolia, Bayezid reached Constantinople, where the Janissaries, the heart of Ottoman power, acclaimed him as Sultan. The law of fratricide was now in motion. Cem, refusing to be a mere governor, declared himself Sultan of an independent Anatolia, minting coins in his own name. He was challenging not just his brother, but the very unity of the empire. A swift, brutal civil war erupted. Bayezid's larger, more experienced army crushed Cem's forces near Yenishehir. The dream of a divided empire died on that battlefield. Cem became a fugitive. He fled to the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, then attempted another failed invasion. Defeated and desperate, he made a fateful choice. He sought asylum from the Knights of St. John on the island of Rhodes, his father's old enemies. He thought he would be a guest. Instead, he became a pawn in the great game of European politics. The knights realized the value of their captive. They moved him to France, keeping him under lock and key. For 13 years, Sultan Bayezid II paid a staggering annual sum, a king's ransom, to his Christian enemies to keep his brother imprisoned. The Pope himself eventually took custody of this valuable guest. Cem Sultan, the poet prince, the son of the conqueror, became a symbol of Ottoman vulnerability. He was a weapon pointed at the heart of the empire, a constant threat of a European-backed civil war. He died in Naples in 1495, far from home, almost certainly poisoned to finally neutralize him. His body was only returned to his homeland years later, a tragic postscript to a life spent in the shadow of the throne he could never claim. Sultan Bayezid II, having secured his throne through civil war and the long, painful saga of his brother Cem, was a man defined by caution. Known as Bayezid the Pious, he preferred mysticism, poetry, and administration to the battlefield conquests of his father. But peace within the dynasty was a luxury he would not be afforded. The viper's nest of succession was stirring once more, this time among his own sons. Of his 8 sons, 3 emerged as serious contenders: Korkut, a scholar; Ahmed, the favored heir and governor of the important city of Amasya; and Selim, the governor of far-off Trabzon, a man who possessed all the ruthless ambition his father seemed to lack. Selim viewed his father's piety as weakness. From his post on the Black Sea, he waged his own wars, building a fierce reputation and a loyal following among the frontier soldiers. He saw his brother Ahmed being groomed for the throne, and knew that under the law of fratricide his own life was on a timer. He would not wait for the executioner's silk cord. Selim began to openly defy his father, demanding a governorship in Europe, closer to the capital, closer to power. Bayezid, now old and weary, was caught in a terrible bind. He was haunted by the ghost of his brother Cem. He wanted nothing more than a peaceful transfer of power to his chosen son, Ahmed. But the Janissaries, the ultimate kingmakers, had other ideas. They had grown tired of a peaceful sultan. They saw in Ahmed another version of the placid Bayezid, but in Selim they saw the reflection of Mehmed the Conqueror. They craved a warrior, a leader who would lead them to glory and plunder. The aging sultan could feel the ground shifting beneath his throne. His authority was eroding, challenged by his own flesh and blood, and undermined by the very soldiers sworn to protect him. A father's love and a sultan's duty were on a collision course, and the empire braced for the storm. The storm broke in 1512. It was not a battle in a distant province, but a coup at the very gates of Topkapi Palace. Prince Selim, having lost an initial battle against his father, had not been defeated. His audacity had only made him a legend among the Janissaries. Now, they took matters into their own hands. Chanting Selim's name, they marched on the palace, their loyalty transferred from the reigning sultan to his rebellious son. For Bayezid II, it was the ultimate nightmare. The soldiers he commanded now demanded his abdication. They presented him with a stark choice: step down for Selim, or they would remove him by force. It was a humiliation no sultan had ever endured. Broken, isolated, and with no loyal forces left to call upon, the old man surrendered. In a solemn, tense ceremony, Bayezid relinquished the most powerful throne in the world to the son who had ripped it from his grasp. Selim I, now Sultan, was a terrifying force of nature. He would earn the name Yavuz, the grim or the stern, and his first acts would demonstrate why. His deposed father, Bayezid, asked only to be allowed to retire to his birthplace. Selim granted his request, but the old sultan would never reach his destination. He died on the road just a month later. Few in the empire believed it was a natural death. The shadow of poison hung heavy over the affair. With his father gone, Selim turned to his brothers. This would not be a protracted civil war like the one between his father and uncle. This would be an extermination. He hunted down his brother Ahmed, defeated him in battle, and had him strangled. He pursued his other brother, Korkut, who was discovered hiding and promptly executed. But Selim did not stop there. To eliminate any possible future claimant, he ordered the execution of all his nephews, some of whom were mere children. The law of fratricide was now a scythe, cutting down every potential rival. Selim had secured his power with an unassailable, brutal finality, wading through the blood of his own family to do so. The reign of Selim's son, Suleiman the Magnificent, is remembered as the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. Yet this magnificent era was stained by the darkest application of the law of fratricide, one that shifted the conflict from brother against brother to father against son. Suleiman had several sons, but none were as brilliant, capable, or beloved as Shehzade Mustafa, his firstborn by his consort Mahidevran. Mustafa was the image of a perfect heir. He was a gifted poet, a skilled warrior, and a just governor, adored by the public and, most importantly, by the Janissaries. They saw in him the future of the empire. But another power was at play in the palace. Hurrem Sultan, Suleiman's legal wife, a former slave girl who had risen to unprecedented influence. Hurrem was fiercely ambitious, not for herself, but for her own sons. She knew that if Mustafa became sultan, her children would be executed. For her and for her powerful son-in-law, Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, Mustafa's very existence was a death sentence. Together they began a subtle, venomous campaign of whispers and forged letters. They preyed on the aging sultan's fears, reminding him of how his own father, Selim, had usurped the throne. They planted the idea that Mustafa, with the army's unwavering support, was planning to do the same. In 1553, during a campaign against Persia, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent. Friends warned the prince it was a trap, but Mustafa, confident in his innocence, went to face his father. He entered the grand imperial tent, expecting an audience. Instead, he was met by the royal executioners, deaf mutes who carried out the sultan's silent, deadly orders. As Suleiman allegedly watched from behind a screen, his greatest son, the hope of the empire, was wrestled to the ground and strangled with a silk bowstring. The army nearly mutinied upon hearing the news, their grief and rage shaking the empire to its core. Suleiman had eliminated a perceived threat, but in doing so, he had murdered his own legacy and cast a permanent, sorrowful shadow over his magnificent reign. The law of fratricide was a cold, impersonal calculus of state, but in the heart of Suleiman, the magnificent's reign, it became a weapon of personal ambition, wielded by the most powerful woman in the empire's history, Hürrem Sultan. She was not born to royalty. She was a slave who had captivated a sultan, shattered centuries of tradition by marrying him, and bore him a brood of sons. Yet her sons were not first in line. That position belonged to Shehzade Mustafa, the brilliant and beloved son of Suleiman's first consort, Mahidevran. Mustafa was the image of his father in his prime, a capable governor, a skilled warrior, adored by the Janissaries and the people. To Hürrem, he was not the future of the dynasty. He was the death warrant for her own children. In the zero-sum game of succession, Mustafa's life meant her sons' deaths. And so, a quiet, venomous war began within the palace walls. Hürrem, aided by her son-in-law, the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, began a masterful campaign of psychological warfare. Whispers were planted in the Sultan's ear. Forged letters hinted at Mustafa's ambition, suggesting he was colluding with the Safavid enemy to usurp the throne. They painted his popularity with the army not as a strength for the empire, but as a threat to the Sultan himself. Suleiman, aging and increasingly isolated in the gilded cage of his own power, began to see his perfect son through a veil of suspicion. The love he held for Mustafa curdled into fear. The tragedy was not just in the lie, but in its plausibility. The system itself made every capable son a potential usurper. In 1553, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his campaign tent in Ereğli. The prince, despite warnings from his advisors, came to kiss his father's hand, seeking to prove his loyalty. He was met not by his father, but by the deaf-mute executioners. Hürrem had won. She had secured the path for her sons, but in doing so, she had corrupted the law from a brutal necessity into a tool of intrigue, drenching the dynasty's future in the blood of its most promising heir. With Shehzade Mustafa eliminated, Hürrem Sultan believed she had paved a golden road for her own sons. She had miscalculated the corrosive nature of the system she had so expertly manipulated. The law didn't just eliminate rivals, it created them. The two remaining sons, Selim and Bayezid, were now locked in the same mortal combat she had engineered for Mustafa. The contest was a study in contrasts. Selim, known to history as the Sot, was a poet, a hedonist, and a patient political operator who preferred the comforts of his provincial palace. Bayezid was the warrior, fiery, ambitious, and popular with the military, a ghost of his murdered half-brother Mustafa. As long as Hürrem was alive, she maintained a fragile peace between them. But upon her death in 1558, the gloves came off. Suleiman, now a grieving and weary old man, could only watch as the monster he had fed turned on his own house. The empire was split into two armed camps. It was no longer a matter of a silent execution in a tent. This was open civil war. Brothers raised armies against each other, and the Anatolian heartland became their battlefield. In May 1559, their forces clashed near Konya. It was a bloody, decisive affair. Selim, backed by the full might of the Sultan's resources, crushed Bayezid's army. Defeated and branded a rebel, Bayezid fled with his 4 young sons, seeking refuge in the court of the Ottomans' arch-nemesis, the Safavid Shah Tahmasp. This was the ultimate treason. For 2 years, a tense diplomatic game played out. Suleiman, the magnificent emperor, was forced to negotiate with his enemy for the return of his own renegade son. Finally, for a staggering sum of gold, the Shah delivered Bayezid and his sons to Ottoman executioners. In 1561, in the Persian city of Qazvin, a father's order, carried out at the behest of a brother, extinguished another branch of the Ottoman line. The law had escalated beyond the palace walls, consuming thousands of lives in its fire. The death of Selim II in 1574 was a masterclass in the grim theater of Ottoman succession. The Sultan had died, but the empire could not know. His son and heir, Shehzadi Murad, was hundreds of miles away in his governorate of Manisa. For the law to function, for the transfer of power to be seamless and absolute, the throne could not be empty for a moment. Any power vacuum was an invitation for a rival prince to make his move. The Grand Vizier, the legendary Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, and Murad's powerful mother, Nurbanu Sultan, orchestrated a chilling deception. They concealed Selim's body in a chamber packed with ice and continued to run the empire in his name. Messengers rode day and night, carrying the coded message to Murad: "Your father is ill. Come to Istanbul at once." Murad understood. He raced to the capital, arriving under the cover of darkness and slipping into the palace unnoticed. Only then, once the heir was present, was the old sultan's death announced. Murad III's first act as sovereign was not to receive oaths of fealty or to address his court. It was to sign the death warrants of his 5 younger half-brothers. The chief eunuch delivered the order, and the royal executioners, the deaf-mute Bostansis, were dispatched to the prince's chambers. There was no trial, no accusation of treason. Their crime was simply their bloodline. They were potential rivals, and the state demanded their elimination for the sake of stability. The next morning, as Murad III made his first public appearance as Sultan, the citizens of Istanbul saw a grim procession accompanying him. Behind the new ruler, carried on the shoulders of palace servants, were 5 small coffins containing the bodies of his brothers. They were laid to rest beside their father, Selim II. The reign began with a funeral. This was the law of fratricide in its purest, most efficient form, a swift, preemptive strike, devoid of the intrigue of Hurrem's era or the open warfare of Selim and Bayezid. It was a cold, brutal, and public declaration that the Sultan's power was absolute, established on a foundation of his own brothers' corpses. If the accession of Murad III was a chilling display of efficiency, the enthronement of his son, Mehmed III, in 1595 was the law's descent into utter horror. It was an event so monstrous it would forever stain the dynasty and mark the beginning of the end for the practice of sanctioned fratricide. Mehmed was also away in Manisa when his father died. His mother, the formidable Safiye Sultan, managed the transition. But the scale of the task awaiting him was unprecedented. Murad III had been prolific, leaving behind 19 sons in the palace harem. The eldest was a grown man. The youngest were infants, still nursing at their mothers' breasts. Upon his arrival in Istanbul, Mehmed III, a man known to be pious but also deeply insecure, confirmed the order. The executioners were sent in. What followed was not a silent, orderly procedure, but a night of unspeakable terror that echoed through the halls of the Topkapi Palace. Chroniclers record the heartbreaking details. The deaf-mute executioners, accustomed to strangling strong men, hesitated at the sight of the children. One of the oldest princes, a gifted musician, was said to have pleaded for his life, offering to live as a humble dervish. The mothers of the condemned boys begged and screamed, clawing at the executioners, trying to shield their sons. The historian Mustafa Ali wrote of the wailing and lamentation that filled the palace, a sound that reached the public outside. The next day, 19 coffins of varying sizes were carried out of the palace. The sheer number, the youth of the victims, shocked the empire to its core. This was no longer an abstract principle of statecraft, a necessary evil to prevent civil war. This was a massacre of children. The public revulsion was palpable. The law, once seen as a pillar of Ottoman strength, was now viewed as a source of dynastic shame and divine wrath. Mehmed III's reign began under a dark cloud from which it would never emerge. The Night of Screams had revealed the true face of the law, and it was a face so hideous that the dynasty itself could no longer bear to look at it. To be born a prince of the House of Osman was to be born with a silk cord already wrapped loosely around your neck. From the moment you drew breath, you were both a potential sovereign and a condemned man. This was the chilling paradox that shaped the mind of every Shehzad. Imagine a childhood where every brother is not a companion, but a mortal rival. Every game of swords is a rehearsal for a genuine battle. Every whispered conversation in the palace corridors could be a conspiracy. Affection was a liability, trust a fatal error. The love for a brother had to be buried under layers of ambition and fear, for one day you would either have to order his death or he would order yours. The system was designed to foster this brutal competition. Promising princes were sent to govern provinces, the sancaks. This was no mere apprenticeship. It was a proving ground. Here, a prince had to learn to rule, to command an army, to build alliances and a treasury. He was, in effect, building a power base for the war that was to come. The entire empire watched these provincial courts, placing their bets on which son would prevail when the old sultan's health began to fail. Then came the news, carried by the fastest riders: the sultan is dead. What followed was not a period of mourning, but a frantic, desperate race to the capital. The first prince to reach Constantinople, to secure the treasury and the loyalty of the Janissaries, was the new sultan. For all the others, the race was over. Their arrival would be met not with a crown, but with the silent executioners. This life, lived on a knife's edge, forged men of immense capability and ruthless cruelty. It created conquerors like Selim the Grim, but it also shattered countless others, forcing them into a state of perpetual, gnawing paranoia where survival was the only virtue. In 1603, the great wheel of Ottoman succession shuddered and cracked. A boy of 13, Ahmed I, ascended to the throne of the world. He was an anomaly. He had never governed a province, never led an army, and his hands were clean of a brother's blood. His own father, Mehmed III, had begun his reign with one of the most horrific acts of fratricide in the empire's history, executing 19 of his brothers and half-brothers. The line of small coffins being carried out of the Topkapi Palace was a fresh, traumatic memory for the court and the people of Constantinople. Now, young Ahmed sat on that same throne, and he had a brother of his own, a small, mentally fragile child named Mustafa. The law, the state, and a century and a half of brutal tradition demanded the boy's death. The executioners awaited the order, but the order never came. Why? Why did this boy sultan flinch where hardened men before him had not? Perhaps it was the sheer horror of his father's actions that gave him pause. Perhaps it was the influence of the powerful women in his life, his mother Handan Sultan, or his beloved Kosum, who may have argued for mercy. Or maybe it was a pragmatic calculation. Ahmed was young, had no sons of his own yet, and the dynasty rested on a knife's edge. If he were to die, the only male heir to the House of Osman was little Mustafa. To kill him would be to risk extinguishing the sacred dynastic line itself. Whatever the reason, pity, politics, or piety, Ahmed's hesitation was a revolution. He did not formally abolish the law of fratricide, but by sparing his brother, he shattered its terrible, absolute power. It was a single act of clemency that would echo through the coming centuries, replacing the certainty of the silk cord with a new, unforeseen form of chaos. Ahmed's mercy required a solution. If princes were not to be killed, what was to be done with them? They could not be sent to the provinces, where they might raise armies and foment rebellion. They could not be allowed to live freely in the capital, where they would become magnets for conspirators. The answer was an innovation of terrible genius, the cafes, or the cage. Tucked away in a secluded section of the Topkapi Palace, the cafes was a set of opulent apartments that became a prison for the Sultan's brothers and other male relatives. It was a gilded cage in the most literal sense. The princes were surrounded by luxury: fine silks, precious jewels, lavish meals, and beautiful concubines. But the windows were barred, the gates were locked, and the world outside ceased to exist. Their only companions were deaf-mute servants, ensuring no secrets could be passed, and their chosen women were often sterilized, preventing the birth of any new claimants to the throne. Life in the cafes was a living death. Decades could pass in monotonous, mind-numbing isolation. Princes received no training in statecraft, no experience in warfare, no knowledge of the empire they might one day be called upon to rule. They were ghosts haunting the imperial palace, their existence a closely guarded secret. This profound isolation bred its own horrors. Without purpose or stimulation, many princes descended into madness, alcoholism, or debilitating depression. They lived in a state of constant terror, knowing that a new sultan's accession, or even a passing whim, could still result in their execution. The cafes ended the race to the throne, but it replaced the death of the body with the death of the mind, creating a reservoir of damaged, incompetent men from which the empire would now draw its future rulers. The Law of Fratricide was a brutal but effective mechanism of political Darwinism. For all its cruelty, it ensured that the man who survived to become sultan was, by definition, the most cunning, capable, and ruthless of his generation. He had proven his mettle by governing a province, commanding loyalty, and winning a war for survival. The cafes system, born from Ahmed I's mercy, systematically destroyed this process. The price of saving the princes' lives was the destruction of their competence. When a sultan died, his successor was now fetched not from a battlefield or a governor's mansion, but from a locked room where he may have spent 30 or 40 years in terrified isolation. The result was a new and insidious form of chaos. The empire was now ruled by a succession of men who were utterly unprepared for the immense burden of power. Men like Murad IV, who compensated for his isolation with terrifying cruelty, or Ibrahim the Mad, whose entire reign was a spectacle of debauchery and insanity born from decades of confinement. This weakness at the top created a power vacuum. Nature and politics abhor a vacuum, and it was quickly filled. The Sultan's mother, the Valid Sultan, and other powerful women of the harem began to wield unprecedented influence, ruling the empire from behind the curtains of the seraglio. Grand viziers and janissary commanders found they could manipulate a weak-minded sultan, leading to an era of palace coups, depositions, and assassinations. The bloody certainty of fraternal civil war was replaced by the slow rot of endemic corruption and court intrigue. The empire no longer renewed itself through fire and blood. Instead, it began to stagnate from the head down. The mercy of one boy sultan had saved his brother, but in doing so, it had inadvertently set the mighty Ottoman Empire on a long, slow path of decline. The alternative to the silken bowstring was not freedom. It was a different kind of death, a slow decay of the soul in a gilded prison known as the cafes, the cage, and no sultan embodied the psychological horror of this new system more than Ibrahim. For 22 years, while his formidable brother Murad IV reigned with an iron fist, Ibrahim lived in the cage. He was not a prince awaiting a governorship. He was a condemned man awaiting a delayed execution. Every footstep in the hall, every unexpected knock, could have been the royal executioners arriving to end his life. He saw his other brothers dragged out and strangled, and he lived in a state of perpetual, mind-shattering terror. When Murad died in 1640, and the palace officials came to proclaim Ibrahim as the new sultan, he was convinced it was a trick. He barricaded his door, certain they were Murad's executioners. Only when his mother, Kosovo Sultan, presented him with Murad's corpse did he finally believe his life was spared. But his mind was not. The man who emerged from the cafes was not a ruler. He was a shattered vessel of trauma. His reign descended into a maelstrom of paranoia and debauchery. He was obsessed with amber, sable furs, and immense women, sending his agents across the empire to satisfy his bizarre and costly whims. He would fly into terrifying rages, executing officials on a whim. His paranoia, born from 2 decades of fearing for his life, now infected the entire court. The cage had saved Ibrahim's body from his brother's executioners, but it had irrevocably broken his mind. The empire was now ruled by a madman, a direct product of the dynasty's desperate attempt to escape the bloody legacy of fratricide. The cure, it seemed, was becoming as poisonous as the disease. With the reign of Ibrahim the Mad ending in his deposition and eventual strangulation, a grim echo of the very law he survived, the Ottoman dynasty fully embraced the cafes. The age of systematic, state-sanctioned fratricide was over, but the ghost of the practice lingered in the shadowed halls of Topkapi Palace. The law was gone, but the rationale behind it, the existential fear of a rival claimant to the throne, remained a potent political weapon. Power had shifted. With a succession of child sultans or mentally fragile men emerging from the cage, true authority now rested with powerful Valid sultans, like Kosum and Turhan, and ambitious grand viziers. The princes, locked away in the cafes, were no longer just brothers. They were pawns in the ruthless games of these new power brokers. A prince could be brought out to replace an inconvenient sultan, or he could be eliminated to secure the position of the current one. The execution of a brother was no longer a state necessity upon accession, but a strategic option during a crisis. During the long reign of Mehmed IV, who ascended the throne as a child, this grim reality played out. In 1651, a conspiracy was uncovered, and to quell instability and remove any potential figureheads for rebellion, his younger half-brothers, Suleiman and Ahmed, were executed. The silken bowstring was brought out once more. It was not the automatic, brutal efficiency of Mehmed the Conqueror's law. Instead, it was a desperate, reactive measure, a sign that the old fears could still bubble to the surface. The tradition was dying, sputtering in the dark, its last echoes a testament to the inescapable paranoia that haunted the House of Osman. Was this brutal law, this culling of the dynasty's own blood, truly necessary? To our modern sensibilities, the answer is a resounding no. It is the act of monsters, a relic of a barbaric age. But to judge it solely by our standards is to miss the terrifying calculus of its time. Historians who defend the practice, or at least explain its logic, point to the existential chaos of Ottoman civil wars. The interregnum after the capture of Bayezid I by Tamerlane saw the empire tear itself apart for over a decade as his sons fought bloody wars for the throne. The state nearly collapsed. In this context, the law of fratricide, codified by Mehmed II, was a form of brutal state surgery. It was the amputation of a limb to save the life of the body politic, embodied in the Turkish proverb, "For the sake of the nation, one sacrifices the individual." The law ensured what the empire needed above all else: stability and a single, undisputed line of authority. It prevented the realm from being fractured among warring princes, a fate that had destroyed countless other Turkic empires. Yet the opposing argument is just as powerful. The law was a moral and genetic catastrophe. It fostered a culture of absolute paranoia, where a father had to view his son as a potential assassin, and a brother saw his sibling as his future executioner. It robbed the empire of countless talented, intelligent, and capable princes, men like Suleiman's son, Mustafa, who was by all accounts a brilliant commander and administrator. Instead of a pool of experienced heirs who had governed provinces and led armies, the dynasty was left with a single, often isolated, survivor. It was a system that traded long-term dynastic health for short-term political stability. The debate is not about good versus evil, but about two competing visions of survival. Was it better to risk the state's collapse in a civil war, or to sacrifice the dynasty's own sons to prevent it. The Law of Fratricide was a fire that burned so brightly it eventually consumed the very fuel it was meant to protect. When the killing stopped and the cage became the norm, the dynasty entered a new, more insidious phase of decay. The long shadow cast by the law was not one of blood, but of incompetence. The early sultans, Mehmed the Conqueror, Selim the Grim, Suleiman the Magnificent, were products of a ruthless Darwinian system. They had to be cunning, strong, and experienced. They governed provinces, commanded armies, and learned statecraft at the sharp end of a sword, all while knowing their brothers were their rivals. They earned the throne. The sultans who emerged from the cafes, however, inherited it. They were men who had spent their entire adult lives in luxurious confinement, with no training in governance, no military experience, and no understanding of the vast empire they were meant to rule. Their world was the gilded walls of their prison, their companions the servants and concubines chosen for them. They were often psychologically scarred, paranoid, or simply detached from reality. This created a vacuum at the very center of the Ottoman state. Power, abhorring a vacuum, flowed elsewhere. It flowed to the Sultan's mother, the Valid Sultan. It flowed to the chief eunuchs and the powerful women of the harem. Most significantly, it flowed to the Grand Viziers, who became the de facto rulers of the empire. The decline in the quality of the sultans directly correlates with the long, slow stagnation of the empire. While Europe was experiencing the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution, the Ottoman Empire was often led by men wholly unprepared for the challenges of a changing world. The solution to the bloody problem of civil war had created a new, quieter crisis, a dynasty of unprepared sovereigns ruling in name only. The law's long shadow was, ultimately, the twilight of the Ottoman Empire itself.